My name is Stephanie, and if someone had told me back then that in a matter of weeks my life would be turned upside down, I would have laughed. I had it all planned out, day by day, step by step, according to those meticulous plans I'd scribbled in my notebook while sitting in the library before exams. I knew for certain that as soon as I graduated, a well-paying job, a rented apartment, my own independent life awaited me, and maybe even the first serious step toward something bigger, something that had always seemed so close and so real. At 22, I viewed the future as an open road, just waiting to be walked. But that smooth path was shattered in an instant when the phone rang, and my mother's name appeared on the screen. "Stephanie, honey, we need to talk," I heard on the other end, and something in her voice alarmed me so much that I almost had to interrupt her immediately. She seemed to be swallowing her words, trying to breathe and speak at the same time, and only then did I realize Mom was crying. "Can you come home this weekend? It's about your father." Those words made my insides clench, and the entire Friday drive home turned into an agonizing weight, with a heavy knot in my stomach. The thought that this "about your father" could be anything. When I crossed the threshold of the house, one glance was enough to know that something had happened here, something serious, something that couldn't be fixed with simple words. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, and for the first time in his life he seemed old to me, pale, exhausted, like a shadow of the strong man who had worked his whole life in construction and never complained of fatigue or pain. Mom fussed around him, adjusting his mug of tea, putting napkins in his cup, as if she were afraid that if she took a single step away, he would literally fall apart. "What's going on?" I asked, leaving my backpack by the door and coming closer. Dad looked up at me, his eyes tired as if burned from the inside, and said, "Last week I went to the doctor about chest pains. Turns out there's something wrong with my heart, baby." At that moment, my world seemed to stop. I felt like I was in someone else's dream, because Dad had always been my rock, the person I could rely on in any trouble. And now he sat before me looking so fragile, so small, and it scared the living daylights out of me. He continued, and every word echoed with pain. "The doctor said I can't do physical work anymore. I'll have to find something easier, part-time." Mom immediately sat down next to him, took his hand, and her gaze darted to me, filled with worry. "We're worried about the mortgage payments, Stephanie. Your dad's new job won't pay as much as his old one." And in that moment, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Our family had never had much money, but we'd always stuck together and somehow managed. And now everything was falling apart just when I was about to take my first steps into adulthood. "And we need to think about your sister, too," Mom added, glancing toward the stairs. Jessica was only 16, still in school, and had her own path ahead of her. Books, clothes, school proms, everything she considered important. And as luck would have it, at that very moment she ran down the stairs, headphones in, oblivious to the tension hanging in the kitchen. So young, so carefree, only 6 years younger than me, yet it felt like we lived in different worlds. "Hi," she called to me as she walked, still glued to her phone, and added, "I didn't know you'd be coming home." I managed only, "Hi, Jess," and was surprised at how foreign and strange my voice sounded. As Jessica disappeared into the living room, my mother leaned closer, her desperate eyes meeting mine. "Stephanie, we know this is a lot, but we need your help. Would you consider moving back home after you graduate? Just for a little while, until we get back on our feet." The words hung in the air, and I suddenly felt the full weight of their expectations, like an invisible weight had settled on my shoulders. I looked at my parents, realizing that these were the people who had always supported me, always helped me, even when they themselves had nothing to spare. How could I say no to them? So I graduated, and instead of long-awaited freedom, I returned to my childhood bedroom, where the walls were covered with old posters and my 9th-grade notebooks were still in the dresser. Just a week later, I found a job at an accounting firm, and frankly, I was proud that they hired me so quickly, proud of my salary, Though not huge, it was quite decent for a recent graduate. I felt grown up, independent, ready to help my family. But this feeling didn't last long. Very long. My first paycheck arrived, and I remember the sweet, almost tingling excitement as I held that check in my hand. For the first time in many years of studying, I felt neither like a student nor like a daughter, but like a grown woman earning her own money. I deposited it immediately, and on the way home, I dreamed of sitting down at the kitchen table that evening, opening my notebook and starting to write a list. How much to put aside, how much to keep for myself, maybe even allowing myself a little joy, a new pair of shoes, or a trip with friends. But as soon as I stepped through the door, my dad's voice pierced that fragile bubble of joy. "Stephanie, the mortgage is due tomorrow," he said hoarsely, and my mom immediately added that the electric bill had arrived today, too. And just like that, in an instant, my entire paycheck vanished, as if it had never existed. The mortgage, utilities, groceries, gas, it all ate up my money so quickly I couldn't even feel its weight in my hands. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that if I just hung in there a little longer, things would get better. But the months stretched into years, and there was no improvement. Every paycheck went straight into the family's expenses, and I, working 40 hours a week, watched my bank account empty again and again, leaving behind only fatigue and a bitter feeling of helplessness. Meanwhile, Jessica, radiant and carefree, received everything she needed for school: new clothes, notebooks, textbooks, even money for lunches with her friends. "She needs to fit in," my mother repeated every time I tried to object, adding that being a teenager was hard enough without feeling poor on top of it all. I remained silent because arguing was pointless, and my heart grew heavier with each conversation. So 2 years passed. Jessica graduated, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself hope. Maybe things would get easier. Maybe I'd finally be able to save a little. Maybe even think about renting my own place and stopping sleeping under the stars of my teenage past. But the joy was short-lived. That night at dinner, Jessica, smiling and her eyes shining, announced she was going to college. My parents beamed with pride. My mom was practically crying with joy. My dad was squeezing her hand, and everyone looked at her as if she'd won the Olympics. I tried to smile too, but in that moment something inside me snapped, because I clearly understood what this meant for me. And so, another item appeared on my list of expenses: college fees. Jessica chose not just any college, but an expensive school with dorms, meal plans, textbooks, allowance, and everything else required for life away from home, and I had to pay for it all. "It's an investment in her future," my mother repeated, as if repeating a mantra, and then added, looking straight into my eyes, "You understand, right, Stephanie?" Family helps family, and I nodded, even though those words hurt and rankled inside, because I was only 24, working full-time, and living as if I were 16, paying for everyone else's life but my own. My childhood bedroom became my cage, and in the evenings I sat on the old couch and scrolled through social media, watching my college friends buy apartments, fly to Europe, meet at wild parties, and share photos of their nights out at restaurants. I looked at their smiles and felt something rot inside me, because even after work I couldn't afford a simple cocktail at a bar. One Friday, as we were folding files in the office, my colleague Sarah approached me with that easy energy that always made me envious and said, "Stephanie, the girls and I are going to a cute guest house just 2 hours from here for the weekend. It's only $200 for everything, including food. Come on, Stephanie, you never do anything fun. Come with us." I smiled and said I'd think about it, but inside I was already trying to figure out how to make it happen, because for the first time in a long time, I wanted to take a risk and do something for myself. That evening at dinner, I carefully, as if casually mentioned, "The girls from work are going away for the weekend. I was thinking maybe I should join." Mom looked up from her plate, and I immediately recognized the expression, a mixture of bewilderment and reproach. "How much would that cost?" she asked, and I, trying to sound casual, replied, "Not that much. Only about $200, I guess." But Mom put down her fork, shook her head, and said softly but firmly, "Stephanie, dear, you know we're tight on money right now." Jessica needs new textbooks, and the water heater is making that funny noise again. $200 could go towards something really useful for the family. I looked at them all. Mom, Dad, and a beaming Jessica typing something on her phone, and felt a cold, heavy lump tighten in my chest, leaving only silence and the desire to lock myself in my room where no one would see my tears. I worked myself to the bone, driving myself into a perpetual cycle of work, bills, and worry to pay for everything, and I realized I couldn't even spend $200 on myself. On the 2 days of rest, I craved so much. "You're right, I muttered, the words catching in my throat because it felt like I'd just given up not on the trip, but on the very idea of having my own life. "I'll tell them I can't go," I finished quietly. Mom smiled, and her smile held this eternal calm, as if I'd made the only right choice. That's the kind of sensible girl I have. "Family always comes first," she said, and I felt something break inside me, but I didn't show it. 2 more years flew by. I turned 26, and for 4 years straight, I'd been supporting the entire family, denying myself literally everything. I'd look at the calendar and realize that the years were slipping away, and I had nothing to show for it except a closet filled with old clothes I'd worn in college and a bank account that rarely had more than a couple $100 left. I'd wake up every morning and feel time slipping away, my dreams dissolving in an endless stream of payments. Meanwhile, Jessica lived as if we belonged to another world. She'd come home from college on break with new clothes, designer jeans, expensive makeup, and a shiny new iPhone, while I was still using my old phone with a cracked screen that should have been thrown out long ago. I'd look at her and wonder, where did she get all that money? I once asked my mom when Jessica, surrounded by her school friends, was laughing and showing them her new purse. Where did she get that? I couldn't resist asking. Mom just waved her hand and replied, "Oh, you know what college kids are like. She probably works part-time or saved up." But there wasn't a shred of confidence in her voice, and a nagging feeling stirred inside me that something didn't add up. Jessica never talked about work, never mentioned having a part-time job, and when I asked her directly, she always deftly changed the subject, as if she slipped through my fingers like soap. The turning point came during spring break, during Jessica's sophomore year. She returned home with suitcases stuffed with new clothes, sneakers that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and some fancy skincare product that cost at least $200. I was cooking dinner in the kitchen when she walked in wearing a brand new leather jacket that still smelled like a store yard. "Nice jacket," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral, but my voice still wavered. "It looks expensive." Jessica shrugged, grabbed a soda from the fridge, and replied matter-of-factly, "Yeah, I bought it last week." There was a great sale downtown. I tried to smile, but inside I was seething, because even with the sale, that jacket was definitely worth $300. "Must be a pretty big sale," I said, and then she paused for a second, then turned to me with a guilty expression that sent shivers down my spine. "Not that much," she muttered. "Jessica, where did you get the money for all this?" I asked, my voice thick with a firmness I hadn't intended. "Last time I checked, you weren't employed." Her cheeks flushed, and her fingers slid down the zipper of her jacket, fiddling with it back and forth, as if seeking refuge in the movement. "This is none of your business, Stephanie," she blurted. "God, why are you always so nosy?" "Because I pay for your tuition, your dorm, your food, and apparently everything else in this house," I snapped, my voice breaking as everything had been building up inside me for too long. "So, yeah, I guess I have a right to know where you got those hundreds of dollars for clothes." She jerked her head up, her eyes flashing with anger. "Maybe if you weren't so stingy, you'd understand that students need nice things too." I felt the blood rush to my face. "Stingy?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended. "Me? Stingy? Jessica, I work 40 hours a week. I give every dollar I have to this family. I can't even afford a new pair of shoes, let alone a $300 jacket." She rolled her eyes as if I were a petulant child and snapped, "Okay, Stephanie, you still wouldn't understand. Then explain it to me, I screamed, anger pulsing in my chest. Where did you get that money? I don't have to tell you anything, Jessica screamed back and then burst into tears as if her own words had pierced her from the inside. Grabbing her soda, she rushed up the stairs, slamming the door behind her, and I was left standing in the middle of the kitchen with shaking hands, feeling like I was drowning in my own family, where my work and sacrifices were unneeded and unappreciated. I stood in the kitchen, shaking with anger and confusion, my hands shaking so hard the knife clanged against the cutting board, and my insides churning with a mixture of pain and anger. Something was seriously wrong, and I knew I wasn't being told the whole truth. Just then, I heard the front door slam and Mom and Dad returned from the grocery store, lugging bags. At that very moment, Jessica's bedroom door slammed shut upstairs, and a tense silence filled the house, like a taut string. "What's all that screaming?" Dad asked, setting the bags on the counter and looking up at me with tired eyes. I clenched my teeth and, barely keeping my voice from breaking, said, "I asked Jessica where she got the money for all those expensive things, and she yelled at me." Mom and Dad exchanged a strange, almost guilty glance. Mom immediately began hastily unpacking groceries, pulling out boxes and cans faster than usual, just to avoid making eye contact. "Stephanie, you need to stop bothering your sister about her personal life," Mom said evenly but too quickly. "Personal life?" I almost laughed bitterly. She spends hundreds of dollars on clothes and accessories. Where does that money come from if she doesn't work? Dad awkwardly cleared his throat, as if he were about to say something important, and mumbled, "Look, Stephanie, your sister just wants to fit in. College is tough, and she needs to feel like she's part of a community." I clenched my fists. "That doesn't answer my question. I'm asking, where does the money come from?" The silence that followed was deafening. Mom continued putting groceries in the cupboard, avoiding my gaze, and Dad suddenly showed an unimaginable interest in how neatly the canned goods were arranged on the shelf. A chill went through my chest and I whispered, "Oh my God." The realization hit me so hard I almost staggered. You give her money. You take what I earn and put it toward your accounts, and you give it to Jessica for her shopping. "Stephanie, it's not that simple," Mom began, but I cut her off. "It's exactly that simple," I screamed, my voice ringing with tension. "I work like crazy to pay the mortgage and the rent, and you take that money and pay for Jessica's shopping." Dad muttered, "She just needs a few nice things. She doesn't want to look poor in front of her friends." I laughed, short and bitter. "So I have to look poor? Should I wear the same old shirts and use a phone with a cracked screen so Jessica can afford another handbag?" Mom's head snapped up, and for the first time in this conversation, she looked directly at me. "You're being selfish, Stephanie. Jessica is trying to get an education and build a future. To do that, she needs to look professional, network, and connect." I couldn't take it anymore. "Professional?" I blurted out. "She buys designer jeans and makeup, not business suits. You call that looking professional?" They both stood before me, their faces frozen with guilt, which they tried to cover up with words. And in that moment, I realized this hadn't been going on for weeks or months, but perhaps years. Every dollar I earned, every ounce of my life, every no I gave to my own desires, all of it was used not for our family, as I thought, but to spoil Jessica. I made so many sacrifices and in return received only lies and accusations that I was foolish for daring to ask for even a crumb for myself. "This stops immediately," I said firmly, feeling my voice gain a strength I hadn't had in a long time. "From now on, I'll only give you money for the essentials. The mortgage, utilities, groceries, that's it. Stop funding Jessica's lifestyle." Mom's face changed. Her gaze grew colder. "Stephanie, you're being unreasonable. Your sister deserves to enjoy her studies." I exploded. "Don't I deserve to have a life? Instead, I'm stuck here, paying for everything for everyone while you lie to my face about where my money goes." Dad raised his hands as if trying to reconcile us. "Maybe we can work something out. Find a compromise." I smiled bitterly. "The compromise is that Jessica stops spending my money on unnecessary nonsense. If she wants designer clothes, she can get a job like any other college student. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving them standing in silence, their faces filled with guilt and confusion. And for the first time in 4 years, I felt like I'd finally stood up for myself, like my no had resounded louder than their constant family first. After that confrontation, the house turned into a battlefield where every room felt like a trench, and any word could trigger another argument. Jessica stopped looking at me altogether, as if I were a ghost, transparent and devoid of any right to exist. She'd pass me in the hallway, her eyes downcast, pretending the walls were more interesting than me, and at breakfast she'd sit stony-faced as if I were nothing. If I tried to start a conversation at dinner, she'd stare at her plate, chewing slowly and silently as if the mere sound of my voice caused her physical pain. At first, I tried to smooth things over, because despite everything, she was still my little sister, my child in a way, the very person I'd once been willing to work day and night for. "Jess, can we talk?" I asked one evening when she came out of the bathroom, the smell of shampoo still lingering in the air. But she looked right through me and without a word locked herself in her room. "Jessica, I'm just trying to talk to you," I shouted into the void, and in response, I heard the door slam so hard it shook the paintings in the hallway. This went on for weeks. Every family dinner turned into torture because Jessica sat like the victim and I like the executioner, and no one made any attempt to break this icy wall. Mom and Dad would give me looks that mixed judgment and weariness, as if I were destroying the fragile family peace simply because I refused to pay for someone else's whims. "You could try being nicer to her," Mom said one evening after Jessica slammed the door again. I almost laughed. "Nicer?" "She's acting like a child because I'm no longer paying for her designer clothes." But Mom just shrugged and said, "She's going through a tough time. She just wants to fit in." "Everyone wants to fit in, Mom," I replied, feeling bitterness rise in my throat. "But that doesn't mean the whole family should ruin itself to meet her needs." But honestly, I was tired of this Cold War. Jessica lived as if I'd ruined her life with a single word, no, and at some point I just stopped trying. Let her pout, let her keep quiet. I had much more serious problems than her childhood grievances, like the fact that at 26 I was still stuck in my childhood, in this house, in this room, with no hope for my own future. A few weeks later, things spiraled even further. Jessica came home for a long weekend, and over dinner, with the house enjoying its first semblance of calm in a long time, she suddenly said, "I want to go to Florida for spring break with my friends. It'll be so much fun. We're planning on staying at a resort right on the beach." Mom and Dad beamed as if they'd just heard she'd won an Olympic gold medal. "That sounds wonderful, honey," Mom drawled, looking at Jessica as if she'd just won a medal. "You deserve a nice vacation after studying so hard." I nearly choked on my food. Hard? The words caught in my throat. I knew how hard she studied. Endless selfies, parties, new clothes, and constant whining about not having enough money. "The trip will cost about $800, Jessica continued, and for the first time in months, her eyes met mine. She said the amount as casually as if it were $8, not realizing that I'd never had that kind of freedom myself. That includes airfare, hotel, and spending money. A silence fell at the table, so thick you could hear the clock ticking in the living room. Mom and Dad turned to me, their faces filled with anticipation, as if they had no doubt that I would be the one to take out the $800 and place it on the table. I slowly put down my fork and shook my head. "No," I said. Jessica's face changed in an instant. Hope turned to anger, her eyes flashed, and she leaned forward sharply. "What do you mean, no?" "That's right," I replied calmly, though inside I was seething. "I'm not going to pay for your spring break trip." "You want to go to Florida? Get a job and save up your own money." "But Stephanie," Dad began, looking confusedly between me and Jessica. "It's important for Jessica to have this experience during college." I gave him a look that immediately silenced him. "Then you'll pay for it," I said icily, Because I'm not going to pay for her vacation when I haven't had a single real day off in 4 years. Jessica slammed her fork down on her plate with such force that the metallic sound echoed throughout the dining room, and for a second, everyone fell silent, staring at her. "I'm not hungry anymore," she almost shouted, turning dramatically and storming out from the table, leaving a cloud of resentment and a ringing silence in her wake. I watched her go, my insides burning with injustice, and my mother sighed heavily and said, "Stephanie, you're too strict. Jessica's still young. She needs to have fun." I barely held back my laughter because there wasn't an ounce of concern for me in her words. "And I should have fun, Mom." "When? Tell me. Will I be able to afford even one vacation? When will I have any kind of experience other than endless bills?" I asked, my voice shaking with pent-up anger. Dad frowned and said in his deep, confident voice, "You're older. You should be more mature about this." I stared at him and said, "I'm old enough to know that spending $800 on a trip is ridiculous when we can barely afford the electricity and water bills." They both looked at me as if I'd just confessed to some mortal sin, as if I were the most selfish woman in the world. But I didn't care. I was tired of being the family ATM, tired of being the sole source of income that everyone took for granted. The next few days turned into even more tense silence. Jessica again pretended I didn't exist. She'd enter the kitchen, grab food, and leave without so much as a glance at me. Mom and Dad became colder than ever, speaking to me only when it was time to discuss bills or purchases, and there was so much iciness in their voices that I felt like a stranger in my own home. But I held my ground. No money for her spring break, no matter how dire the situation seemed to them. Then Mom's birthday came. She asked me to help her prepare the house for the party. "We're inviting everyone," she said, smiling. "Your aunts and uncles, friends from church." I want the house to look perfect. I agreed because despite everything, she was still my mother, and a part of me still yearned to do something nice for her. We spent the whole day cleaning. I washed the windows, dusted, polished the furniture until it shone. I even helped her in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, preparing snacks, though inside I still buzzed with resentment. When we were almost finished, I said, "I'll go upstairs and tidy up the guest room so everything is ready for guests." I grabbed a duster and vacuum cleaner, and half an hour later, sweaty and tired, I fell back on the bed and suddenly realized I was thirsty. I quietly walked downstairs, barefoot so as not to wake anyone in the house, and headed to the kitchen for a glass of water. But as soon as I reached the door, I heard voices. Mom and Jessica were talking by the stairs, quietly, whispering, so that a normal person would probably have passed by without noticing. But I heard my name and froze. Everything inside me told me to stay and listen. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding so loudly I thought they should hear it. "I can't wait for Stephanie to finally move out of here," Jessica said, and there was so much venom in her voice that it made my stomach turn. "The day she leaves, I will personally throw all her things out on the street and turn her room into my walk-in closet." My heart was pounding like crazy, but I didn't leave. Right now," Mom said, and I distinctly heard her laugh softly. "We can't kick her out yet." "We still owe $80,000 on the mortgage." "Well, as soon as we pay it off, she'll move out, right?" Jessica asked. "Yes, dear," Mom said. "And then this house will be mine. You won't leave anything to Stephanie, will you?" Jessica's voice sounded demanding, as if she were testing boundaries. "Of course not," Mom replied calmly. "Stephanie can take care of herself. You're the one who needs our support. Someday this house will be yours, darling." These words hit me like a punch in the stomach. I stood in the hallway, pressed against the wall, listening to my mother and sister discuss me as if I weren't a person, but a bank card with an infinite expiration date. Years of my life, every penny, every weekend, every sleepless night spent working. It all boiled down to them laughing and plotting how to get rid of me as soon as I became unnecessary. I wasn't their daughter and sister. I was their personal bank, a source they could milk for every cent and then throw out into the street. I wanted to rush in there and scream, tell them everything I thought, force them to look me in the eye when they betrayed me. But then an idea occurred to me. something far more rewarding than a simple scandal. Mom's birthday was coming up, and in 2 days our house would be filled with relatives, family, friends, all those who had always considered us a model of closeness and mutual support. And I suddenly realized that it was there, in the presence of witnesses, that the truth needed to be revealed, their perfect masks torn off. I smiled to myself and quietly went upstairs to finish cleaning, and all the while, in my head, I heard, "In 2 days, everyone will find out who you really are." The next 48 hours became the most difficult performance of my life. I rose at breakfast with a smile, as if nothing had happened, helped Mom prepare dishes for guests, polished the silverware until it shone, chatted with Jessica when she deigned to acknowledge my existence, and all the while, I carried their words inside me, those cold, cruel words that are impossible to forget. "We can't kick her out until the mortgage is paid." I packed my bags in advance, hid them deep in a closet where no one would look, and had already found a tiny apartment on the other side of town, signed the lease, and put down a deposit. It might have been cramped, but it was my place, my corner, where I could finally be myself. Mom's birthday arrived and the house was ablaze with lights. The living room was filled with voices, laughter, the smell of baked goods and coffee. Bouquets of flowers were everywhere, and the kitchen was piled high with dishes. Everyone was there. Aunt Linda with her loud laughter, Uncle Mike, who always brought homemade wine, my cousins with their children, the parishioners from church. And together, for a second, we looked like that perfect family they were used to showing off to the world. "Stephanie, darling, you look tired," Aunt Linda said, hugging me tightly and looking into my eyes. "You probably work too much." I smiled at her, though my insides were churning. If only she knew even half the truth. The evening went on as usual. Everyone ate, chatted, reminisced, laughed at old jokes, and everything looked so festive that anyone could have believed it was all a show. Then it was time for presents. Mom sat in a chair surrounded by a mountain of colorful bags and boxes. She opened them one by one, bouquets, elegant jewelry, gift cards to her favorite stores, a beautiful soft sweater from Aunt Linda, and everyone clapped and smiled, watching her beam. Finally, it was my turn. I approached, holding a beautiful envelope I'd bought especially for this moment. "Oh, how sweet," Mom said and smiled, showing everyone that even I hadn't forgotten her special day. She carefully opened the envelope, probably expecting to find money or a card there, as she had before, but when she looked inside, her face became completely blank. There was nothing there. "Where's the present?" she asked, her smile faltering and a look of confusion crossing her face. I looked straight at her and smiled sweetly. "It's exactly what you, Dad, and Jessica deserve." Nothing. A deathly silence fell over the room, so deep you could have heard someone drop a fork. Mom blushed, trying to maintain her dignity. "Stephanie, I don't know what you're talking about." "There must be a mistake." "There's no mistake, Mom," I replied firmly. 2 days ago, I overheard you talking to Jessica. I heard you laughing and saying you couldn't wait for me to move out, that as soon as the mortgage was paid off, I'd be kicked out and the house would go to Jessica. I heard you talking about me as if I weren't a person, just your wallet, and I heard you say I wouldn't get anything. A murmur swept the room. Someone gasped. Uncle Mike looked away. Aunt Linda put her hand to her lips. Jessica turned white as a sheet, her lips trembling. "And," I continued, feeling my voice grow stronger, "I found out that the money I paid for bills, Mom spent on new things for Jessica. I paid for the lights, the water, the food, her college tuition, and you bought her clothes and bags. So why should I give you anything if you've already decided I don't deserve anything?" Dad stood up abruptly, his face turning purple. "Stephanie, it's your mother's birthday. How dare you ruin it with this nonsense?" "Nonsense!" I laughed bitterly, my throat stinging with suppressed tears. "Dad, I supported this family for 4 years. For 4 years, I paid the mortgage, the utilities, the groceries, Jessica's tuition, everything. And this is how you repay me? With plans to throw me out like trash when I'm no longer useful to you? Jessica burst into tears, jumping up from her seat. "Stephanie, you're a terrible sister. I hate you," she cried, tears streaming down her cheeks. But even in her screams, there was a note of petulance, like a child accustomed to receiving everything. "Okay," I said slowly and calmly, as if I were putting a period to a book I'd been dreading for so long. "Because I will no longer be your personal ATM, and from this day forward, not a single dollar of mine will go to paying your bills or whims. I'm moving out today, right now, and I'll never again take on what you call family responsibilities. Your dream has come true, Jessica," I added, meeting her tear-stained eyes. "Now you really will be left without me, and you'll have to pay for your college yourself." At that moment, Aunt Carol, my father's sister, stood up, her face pale and shaken, as if every notion of our family had just been shattered. "Wait," she said slowly, "Stephanie supported the entire family? But your parents always told us she was unemployed, that she was struggling, and you were helping her out of pity." The rest of the relatives began to buzz, exchanging glances and nodding approvingly at her words. "We heard that too," Uncle Mike confirmed, frowning. "We thought Stephanie was getting help, not carrying everyone on her own. I wasn't even surprised because deep down I already knew. Of course they were lying about everything, even about what kind of person I was." "Well, now you know the truth," I said, addressing the room full of stunned faces, and my words rang out firmly and clearly. "I'm sorry if I ruined your holiday, but I couldn't continue this farce any longer." I turned and walked up the stairs, step by step, picking up my suitcases, while behind me, voices buzzed. Someone tried to stop me. Someone whispered, but I no longer listened. When I came downstairs with my bags, the guests were still sitting there, stunned, as if they were watching a TV series rather than real life. I paused at the door and said only one word: "Goodbye." Then I turned and walked out the front door, feeling dozens of eyes on me. Most of the guests followed, chattering incoherently and trying to process what they'd just seen. But that was no longer my concern. I loaded my suitcases into the car, got behind the wheel, and pulled out of the driveway without even looking back. My new apartment was tiny, almost empty, with peeling paint on the walls and old, creaky floors. But when I stepped through the door, it felt like I'd taken my first real breath in 4 years. I felt free. Of course, my family wasn't going to let me go without a fight. Within an hour of leaving, my phone was ringing off the hook. Mom, Dad, Jessica, everyone was calling nonstop, leaving messages, begging, screaming, accusing. But I didn't answer a single call or read a single line of them. A month of silence passed, and then suddenly a distant relative I'd barely spoken to called. "Stephanie, you need to make peace with your parents," she said. "They're having a really hard time without your help." I smiled and said, "Okay," and immediately hung up. Several more people called, each with their own exhortations, each with the same words about how I should forgive and come back, and I hung up on each one without a word. 3 months later, I accidentally learned from mutual friends that Jessica had dropped out of college. She couldn't afford the tuition anymore and was now working as a saleswoman at a mall, trying to somehow help her mom and dad with the mortgage. And you know what? I didn't feel the slightest bit of sympathy. Not at all. Because for the first time in years, I was living my own life. I could afford new clothes, meet friends, save for my future, make plans without fear of someone ruining them. For the first time since graduating from college, I felt like a real person, not just a paycheck. My family made a choice when they decided to turn me into a source of income, when they decided that my love for them was a bottomless purse. They believed they could take advantage of my kindness forever, that I would never see through their plan or stand up for myself. But they were wrong, and now they had to learn to survive without me, just as I had learned to survive without them. I was no longer their food stamp, and I had never felt happier in my life than I did at that moment.